immediately fighting for the center. This opens up lines for queenside development and prepares a solid pawn structure. Challenging white's central ambition, black immediately claims equal territory, preparing to solidify their pawn structure and foster development. Challenging central territory immediately, this move creates sharp pawn tension and opens lines for rapid piece development, aiming to seize the initiative. Solidifying the center and preparing for queen's pawn development, this choice gracefully declines the gambit and aims for a robust pawn structure. Developing a knight to its natural square, this move solidifies central control and prepares for queenside expansion, while indirectly pressuring the d5 pawn. Developing the knight here gracefully contests the central tension, preparing for pawn breaks and improving piece coordination. Solidifying the center and preparing bishop development, this square choice prioritizes a stable pawn structure over immediate central control. A flexible bishop fianchetto prepares a kingside pawn storm, seeking active play and central pressure. Developing the knight here bolsters central influence and prepares castling, fostering a solid setup. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing for potential queenside expansion, this bishop anchors the defense and eyes the central diagonal. Preparing to castle, this bishop subtly influences the central dark squares, setting the stage for a potential kingside assault or reinforcing the pawn chain's stability. Safeguarding the monarch is paramount. A swift castling now secures the king's refuge behind a pawn wall, simultaneously activating a rook for potential central influence on the open files. Safeguarding the monarch by tucking it away behind a pawn wall completes white's initial development, a sensible precaution that prioritizes kingside safety before venturing into the central complexities this semi-Slav structure often breeds. Initiating a knight's journey to the queenside, this maneuver prepares for potential queenside expansion or a flexible redeployment, though it relinquishes immediate central influence and opens a path for white's central pawns to advance further. Instigating a central pawn exchange to disrupt black's pawn structure and open lines for your pieces. Embracing the exchange solidifies black's central pawn structure, preparing to contest the d-file and potentially challenge white's queenside initiative. A subtle pressure cooker is being built, aiming to pry open the queenside and potentially exploit weaknesses around black's undeveloped pieces. Observe how the queen now eyes the c6 pawn and simultaneously prepares for a potential queenside expansion. Bringing the knight to the edge of the board feels like a strategic retreat, aiming to redeploy it to a more active square, perhaps c7 for better control of d5 and potential kingside activity later, while simultaneously preparing to challenge white's queen's pressure on the queenside. This quiet development solidifies the central pawn structure and prepares for a kingside expansion by clearing the way for a rook lift. Injecting a knight to e4 aims to destabilize white's pawn structure, creating outposts and potential tactical disruptions in the center. This active placement challenges the e3 pawn and contests key central squares, hinting at a more aggressive middle game plan for black. Piling pressure onto the queenside, white now mobilizes the rook to support the pawn advance and contest the open c-file. This strategic maneuver aims to generate attacking chances on that flank, forcing black to react and potentially reveal weaknesses in their queenside pawn structure or king safety. Observe how the rook's placement coordinates with the queen and bishop, creating a cohesive attacking unit poised to exploit any hesitation. This exchange dismantles the central pawn structure, opening lines and potentially forcing simplification, but also grants white's queen a commanding presence on the queenside, dictating play along the opened c-file. Solidifying the central presence and freeing the queenside knight, this recapture reestablishes a robust pawn structure for white, while simultaneously eyeing the d-pawn as a potential target and preparing for future piece development that emphasizes pressure along the c-file. Reinforcing the central pawn structure with e6 solidifies black's queenside influence and prepares for a potential queenside expansion, while simultaneously safeguarding the d5 pawn from immediate pressure. Opening up the queenside flank for a potential pawn storm or maneuver creates immediate dynamic possibilities that black must carefully consider. developing the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to trade off white's advanced queen and establish a more solid central presence for black's pieces. Pushing the pawn creates an immediate imbalance, sacrificing pawn structure for a foothold on the queenside and potentially disrupting black's queenside coordination. Asserting control over the b-file while preparing to potentially challenge white's queenside expansion. Knight venturing out to the rim aims to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and potentially exploit the advance to pawn. Solidifying the bishop's role on this diagonal, the piece now aims to harass white's queenside expansion and potentially swing over to support a kingside attack. Unleashing a knight onto the outpost at c5 immediately challenges black's pawn structure and aims to disrupt its cohesive defense, potentially creating a permanent weakness on d6 if the knight can't be dislodged. A strategic retreat, the queen abandons the central tension, repositioning to bolster the queenside and potentially prepare for a queenside pawn push. This maneuver subtly shifts the battleground. Black acknowledges the pressure on the queenside generated by white's advanced pawns and knight, choosing to consolidate rather than directly confront. Observe how the queen's new placement on d6 offers defensive support to the b6 pawn and indirectly discourages white's knight on c5 from further incursions. Consider the potential for this queen to participate in future queenside expansion, perhaps supporting a move like b5, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create counterplay. The relinquishing of the queen's central standoff allows for a more deliberate build-up, prioritizing defensive solidity before launching an offensive. A subtle repositioning aiming to bolster the king's defense and potentially reroute the knight towards a more active square, while simultaneously preparing to contest the central files should black advance their pawns further. Initiating a counter-pressure campaign along the open c-file, black fortifies their central influence and prepares to challenge white's queenside expansion by redeploying the rook to its most active square. Gaining queenside space while creating potential outpost opportunities for white's knight on c5, this aggressive positioning of the queen aims to pressure black's pawn structure and discourage counterplay, subtly preparing for a future central push or flank attack. Shifting the bishop to f8 initiates a crucial defensive maneuver, aiming to solidify the kingside pawn structure and potentially reroute the bishop to a more active diagonal, perhaps the h6c1 diagonal, if an opportune moment arises, while simultaneously contesting control of the light squares and preparing for potential pawn breaks or piece exchanges that might arise from white's queenside expansion. Unlocking the queenside expansion, the pawn bravely advances, aiming to conquer more territory and potentially pin black's pieces against their own defenses. Shifting the bishop to the queenside outposts the light-squared defender, preparing for a potential knight repositioning to f6, or perhaps even allowing the c-pawn to advance and contest the queenside space. Consolidating the queen on a square that offers both defensive support for the kingside and potential offensive avenues on the queenside, this maneuver aims to exploit black's somewhat passive queenside development, particularly the trapped bishop on c8. It also prepares to challenge the c-file more effectively should black opt for further pawn advances or piece exchanges that could open lines towards white's monarch. Opening a new path for the queen's bishop to potentially activate down the queenside is the intention behind this pawn push, but it simultaneously creates a weakness on the c6 square that the knight can no longer comfortably defend. Breaking the pawn chain on the queenside now, this pawn grab aims to disrupt black's entire queenside structure, potentially creating weaknesses for later exploitation. Initiating the recapture embraces the open file, but it fundamentally alters the pawn structure, potentially creating weaknesses down the file for black's queenside. 22 and e3, by repositioning the knight to a central outpost, white not only avoids the immediate threat of the bishop on c6, but also prepares to exert pressure along the d-file and potentially support a kingside advance. This knight's journey from the edge to the heart of the action exemplifies a classic positional maneuver aimed at improving piece activity and creating new attacking avenues, while also subtly reinforcing the pawn chain on the queenside. Reorganizing the queen for a potential exchange or defensive maneuver. The current position features white's knight on c5 exerting pressure, and black's queen has been somewhat passive. Moving the queen to d8 aims to achieve several things simultaneously. Firstly, it offers a potential path for the queen to be exchanged if white desires, which could simplify the position and alleviate some pressure. Secondly, it allows the queen to participate more actively in defending the kingside should an attack materialize. It also prepares for a potential move of the bishop on c8, freeing up that piece. The queen's redeployment demonstrates a desire to improve her coordination with the rest of black's forces and potentially exploit any positional weaknesses white might create. This is a nuanced repositioning, prioritizing flexibility and defensive solidity while keeping attacking options open. Preparing a space for the king's rook to potentially join the action on the open f-file, while simultaneously creating a defensive shield for the monarch, signifies a prudent consolidation of white's position. A fascinating attempt to exploit the open b-file, this knight repositions to a seemingly aggressive outpost. However, consider the potential for white to swiftly neutralize this intrusion. The fianchetto structure on white's kingside is solid, and this black knight, while active, lacks immediate support and could become a target for future pawn pushes or even a strategic retreat by white's bishop. Think about how white might use the open files and the centralized queen to disrupt black's coordination. The question is whether this move gains enough initiative to justify the potential isolation of the knight. The knight's journey to e5 initiates a fascinating pawn structure dance, aiming to unravel black's defensive setup by exploiting the weakened dark squares around the king. The knight's embarkation onto d6 seeks to disrupt white's harmonious piece arrangement, aiming to create counterplay by potentially forcing exchanges or repositioning for a more active role on the kingside. This move strategically reroutes the knight, abandoning the central outpost it held and preparing to reinvest itself on a more active square, potentially the kingside, aiming to improve piece harmony and avoid passive defense. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside is a daring gamble, challenging the structural integrity of white's nascent kingside defense and potentially opening attacking lines for black's pieces. A subtle repositioning of the knight, aiming to contest the d-file and perhaps liberate the queenside pawns from their current static arrangement. Alternative 1, shifting the knight back, white prepares to challenge black's central pawn mass and offers a potential exchange on d6, aiming to simplify into a more favorable structure. Alternative 2, realigning the knight to potentially support a pawn push on the kingside or to provide defensive cover for the king, anticipating further queenside maneuvering by black. Alternative 3, a defensive retreat that allows for flexibility, possibly setting up a future attack on the d-file or a repositioning to a more active square as the game evolves. Alternative 4, this knight redeployment signals a desire to contest central control and potentially disrupt black's well-entrenched pawn chain, a quiet but important shift in the positional battle. Alternative 5, the knight's return journey hints at a desire to reroute it to a more influential square, perhaps on the kingside, while also preparing to meet black's active pieces with solid defense. Finally, black injects some dynamism into this cramped position by challenging white's knight and opening up the c-file for potential counterplay. Initiating an exchange that aims to simplify the position and potentially exploit the slight inactivity of black's queenside pieces, white steps into a more open game. This decision to trade knights on c4 offers a chance to gain a pawn majority on the kingside if black isn't careful, while also freeing up white's own pieces to seek more dynamic squares, perhaps focusing on the d-file or preparing a maneuver with the queen. It's a positional gamble, seeking to leverage the clarity of a less cluttered board for future attacking intentions. The rook's capture opens a critical diagonal, directly challenging white's queenside pawn structure and threatening to exploit the weakened c-file, forcing a sharp reevaluation of white's defensive setup. Pivoting the knight to f4 suddenly loosens the grip on the d5 pawn and injects dynamism into white's position, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's king with potential knight outposts on e6 or d5 if the pawn structure allows. Reasserting influence on the light squares and preparing to activate the bishop towards the kingside is the primary aim here, a prudent choice given the current pawn structure. This exchange dramatically reshapes the pawn structure, opening the c-file and presenting white with a tactical decision point that could unravel black's carefully constructed defenses. By capturing the pawn, white not only gains material, but also creates immediate pressure along the now open vertical, potentially targeting black's undeveloped pieces or even the castled king. Black must carefully assess whether to recapture or seek counterplay, as a misstep here could lead to a cascade of further exchanges or a positional disadvantage. The board's complexity has just escalated significantly. Sensing the opponent's queen is a bit exposed, black shifts it back, hoping to consolidate the queenside pressure while keeping an eye on potential discoveries down the c-file. Unlocking a crucial diagonal for the queen, b5*, injects dynamism into the position by challenging black's pawn structure and potentially opening lines for white's pieces. Unleashing the pawn storm on the kingside, black initiates a bold offensive, aiming to disrupt white's entrenched pieces and pry open lines towards the enemy monarch, hoping to exploit the slightly exposed royal position. Seeking to anchor the knight and prepare for potential queenside expansion, white repositions the piece for more active participation. Unleashing the king's pawn forward, e5*, immediately challenges the centralized knight and seeks to disrupt white's queenside structure, injecting a vital element of dynamism into the otherwise static position. Unleashing the power of the open file, white immediately seeks to exploit the newly created diagonal for the queen and put pressure on black's pawn structure, aiming to disrupt any comfortable pawn breaks. The rook's return to the open file ignites the critical struggle for the c-file, with black aiming to leverage its presence to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and potentially prepare a breakthrough. Unlocking the c-file with this pawn thrust immediately creates significant pressure on black's queenside, particularly on the d6 square and potentially opening lines towards the now exposed black king. White's intention is clear, to exploit the open central files that are soon to appear, aiming for a direct assault. This aggression is a stark contrast to the previously maneuvering play, signifying a decisive shift in the game's character towards open conflict. Reclaiming the queen after the exchange offers a ray of hope by centralizing the piece, though the pawn structure on the queenside remains a significant concern, potentially leading to long-term weaknesses against white's more flexible pawn majority. A pivotal moment arrives as the queens depart the board, ushering in a new strategic phase where pawn structures and piece activity will dictate the flow. The sudden exchange of queens fundamentally alters the battlefield, transitioning the game into a pawn-centric endgame where the structural integrity of black's king becomes paramount. Re-establishing knight presence in the center, this maneuver aims to reactivate the piece from its passive post and prepare for potential infiltration or defense. Stepping into the pawn chain's path, this thrust aims to disrupt white's knight outpost and create dynamic play on the kingside, potentially forcing a favorable pawn exchange to open lines for black's rook. Relocating the monarch to f1 fortifies the kingside against potential further pawn incursions, simultaneously preparing to potentially activate the rook via the central files and preventing any back-rank weaknesses that might arise from black's encroaching e-pawn. The bishop emerges from its pawn shield, eyeing the weakened light squares and preparing to potentially infiltrate white's position. Initiating the rook's journey to the queenside aims to leverage the open file and potentially challenge black's weakened pawn structure, aiming for a more active endgame where white's better-placed pieces can exploit the free space. Reactivating the bishop to the more active diagonal now forces white to confront the doubled pawns on the queenside, a positional weakness that can be exploited in the coming endgame transition. Liberating the pawn chain is the immediate goal, aiming to disrupt black's cramped pieces and potentially open lines for the rook and knight. The pawn sacrifice here opens a dynamic diagonal for the bishop and aims to disrupt white's coordination, creating immediate tactical complications that demand precise calculation. Asserting control over the d-file, this knight redeploys to a more central posting, eyeing potential weaknesses that might emerge as the pawn structure simplifies. This quiet pawn push might seem passive, but it skillfully shores up weaknesses on the kingside, preventing white's knight from finding any cozy squares and creating a much-needed breathing room for black's pieces to potentially regroup. Reasserting central influence, the knight embarks on a journey from its temporarily withdrawn position to a commanding square, aiming to exploit the newly opened e-file and pressure black's potentially vulnerable king. Securing the king's immediate safety becomes paramount with the black monarch, now somewhat exposed by the prior exchanges on the king's side. The knight surges to c6, a bold outpost that immediately questions black's central pawn structure and threatens to unravel their defenses. The bishop sacrifices its mobility on the queen's side, a desperate attempt to activate it within the now fragmented pawn structure, aiming to disrupt white's advancing pieces and perhaps create some endgame counterplay with the remaining pawns. Initiating a cautious repositioning of the monarch towards a more active role, seeking to potentially influence the central struggle or provide support should the opponent's pieces advance further. Repositioning the bishop to d5 is a pragmatic choice, eyeing the pawn on e4 and seeking greater scope across the queen's side, a sensible endeavor given white's apparent king safety concerns and the potential for a pawn storm. A well-timed rook maneuver aims to liberate the white king from its passive corner position and activate the remaining pieces by clearing the d-file for potential breakthroughs or defensive repositioning. Sacrificing a rook to expose the enemy king and potentially create a passed pawn is a bold gambit, aiming to disrupt white's seemingly solid central pawn structure and initiate active counterplay. The monarch scurries away from the escalating action, seeking a less exposed square as the potential for a final assault looms large with the open files. The black bishop now eyes the white king's shelter from its new outpost, simultaneously bolstering the pawn on e4. A final check of the board reveals the enemy king is awkwardly placed, and this check forces it to a less secure square, potentially setting up a decisive discovered attack or forcing concessions. The rook on f7 initiates a crucial defensive maneuver, aiming to shield the vulnerable king from the menacing white rook and potentially prepare for a retreat to a more secure square, even though the present pawn structure offers little sanctuary. Unlocking the potential of the rook on the 6th rank, this move initiates a powerful assault on black's weakened pawn structure, aiming to dismantle the defensive wall around the king. The bishop retreats to a less active square, abandoning the crucial diagonal and surrendering central influence. Knight maneuver to a superior square, eyeing potential forks and disrupting black's coordinated pieces. Unleashing a decisive check, the bishop's diagonal now pierces white's king, creating an immediate crisis and forcing a concession. The king's perilous journey across the board, seeking shelter, highlights the urgent need for more defensive support, as the opposing bishop pair poses a severe threat. The rook's repositioning to f8 aims to support the passed pawn's advance while maintaining pressure on the d-file, a crucial battleground. Forcing the king to an even more restricted square, this check aims to clear the path for the rook's aggressive foray along the 7th rank. Sensing an opportunity to regroup his scattered forces, the king bravely ventures forward, aiming to support the beleaguered rook and potentially offer some defensive assistance in the increasingly complex endgame landscape. A swift recapture seals the pawn structure, simplifying into an endgame where white's active pieces hold a slight edge. Snatching the pawn on e5 immediately simplifies the position, a critical decision as the endgame approaches. Clearing the decks for a potential king hunt now that the exchanges are nearly complete, aiming to activate the monarch into the fray. Bringing the rook into the fray creates immediate complications, aiming to exploit the open file and pressure white's isolated pawns. Unleashing the bishop's diagonal, white seeks to disrupt black's coordinated pieces, aiming to exploit potential weaknesses on the king side. This audacious king walk is a desperate gambit to shake up a thoroughly lost position, sacrificing immediate king safety for a sliver of counterplay that's unlikely to materialize against solid defense. Unlocking the passed pawn's potential is now the paramount concern, aiming to escort it towards promotion while preventing the adversary's counterplay. Discovered checks can be incredibly disruptive, especially when they force the opponent's king to a more exposed square, which is precisely what happens here as the rook swings onto the 7th rank. The king, now exposed on the central square, attempts a desperate retreat, though it's unlikely to offer salvation from black's persistent pressure. The bishop's repositioning creates a dangerous battery on the file, targeting the exposed white king. The rook is now poised to exploit the open d-file, aiming to penetrate black's position and create threats against the vulnerable king. Capturing the rook with the pawn on h2 opens up a decisive attack on white's king, capitalizing on the misplaced bishop and the exposed position of the monarch. The rook slides to the c-file, aiming to exploit the open lines and potentially pressure the isolated pawn on a6 if the bishop vacates its current post. Embracing the open files and exploiting the exposed king position, black boldly marches the monarch towards the action, seeking to disrupt white's coordination and potentially create counterplay in this tense endgame. Asserting dominion over the c-file, this rook now eyes potential breakthroughs and applies pressure on black's exposed monarch. The initiative shifts dramatically as black's king boldly ventures out, directly challenging white's rook and potentially opening lines for counterplay despite the material deficit. The white king is now actively participating, aiming to exploit the exposed black monarch. King's safety has been severely compromised, and this retreat to f3 offers a desperate attempt to shield the monarch amidst a chaotic board. Seizing the initiative, white's rook boldly ventures onto the 6th rank, directly targeting black's exposed king and threatening to dismantle the pawn structure around it. Accepting the pawn sacrifice and venturing into this endgame with a slightly more active king is a bold choice, potentially leading to interesting tactical skirmishes on the queen side. Seizing the now open 8th rank offers a formidable positional advantage, directly challenging the black king's safety and restricting the bishop's mobility. Unleashing the pawn on the queen side adds a surprising thrust of dynamism to the endgame, threatening to upset the finely balanced material situation. Propelling the pawn forward unlocks a new avenue for white's attack, aiming to sever black's escape routes and potentially create a passed pawn threat down the b-file. Igniting the pawn storm on the king side is a desperate attempt to create counterplay, but it might just open the floodgates for white's connected passed pawns to race to promotion. Promoting the pawn now creates a new dimension of pressure on the king side, forcing black to constantly assess the emerging threats and potentially dedicate more pieces to its defense, thus altering the delicate balance of forces. The rook now assumes a commanding presence on the 2nd rank, a vital staging ground for potential threats against white's monarch or the consolidation of the passed pawn's advance. Initiating the final push to secure victory, white relocates the king to the center, preparing to support the advancing king's pawn and assert dominance over the critical central squares. The black king, exposed and vulnerable, now faces a desperate race to escape the relentless white rook's advances, as the pawn structure offers little to no sanctuary. Focusing on the open files, a king's escape route is immediately shut down, forcing a reevaluation of the defensive setup. The king's sanctuary is shattered, and the rook now eyes the open file, aiming to exploit the exposed monarch. Asserting dominance on the central files, the king scurries to safety. Pushing the pawn forward seeks to create potential weaknesses on the king side, aiming to complicate the endgame with more active piece play or simply to gain space. Preparing to evacuate the king to a safer square is paramount given the remaining threats. A desperate gambit to create a passed pawn, hoping to distract the king from its duties on the queen side. Embracing the open files is paramount now. Pushing the king further into the fray forces black to confront the looming pawn on b7 and the exposed monarchy. The rook's journey across the board, culminating on the 1st rank, now aims to disrupt white's king's safety and potentially fork key pieces, a bold attempt to inject life into the endgame. The king ventures out, a bold gambit to support the pawn's determined march toward promotion, creating a dynamic tension that demands black's immediate attention. The promotion threat looms large, forcing white to confront the advancing pawn's determined march towards the queenside. Capturing the pawn on h2 solidifies white's promotion threat, forcing black to address the looming danger to their king and preventing any counterplay. The rook now sacrifices itself to create a passed pawn, aiming to disrupt white's king's safety and force a desperate defense. The king's march now finds its ultimate goal on the b7 square, solidifying the pawn's promotion potential while steering the monarch away from any lingering threats. The monarch bravely ventures, seeking to disrupt the pawn's relentless march towards promotion. The king finally finds a safer haven on c6, evading the queen's immediate threats and preparing to support the pawn's advance. The queen's ascension finally brings the game to a decisive crossroads, instantly escalating the material balance and injecting immediate, stark threats across the entire board. The rook's infiltration to the 8th rank signals a decisive shift, aiming to corner the black king and exploit the open g-file for a swift checkmate. The pawn's advance to g3 aims to create a protected passed pawn, a critical element in such a simplified endgame, by forcing exchanges and clearing a path towards the 8th rank. The king ventures into the fray, a bold stride to escort the passed pawn and reclaim the initiative in this endgame melee. The monarch scurries, seeking shelter amongst its own pawns, a testament to the exposed situation it finds itself in. Unleashing the full power of the rook on the 7th rank, this pawn push now opens a decisive gateway for the monarch to join the attack, aiming to disrupt black's coordinated defense and secure a winning advantage. Black's queen finds a potent check, exploiting the white king's precarious position and forcing a concession that unravels white's defenses on the kingside, creating immediate threats of further disruption and potential checkmate sequences. Embracing the final stages, the king steps forward, a calculated risk to shepherd the pawn, aiming to solidify the endgame advantage despite the encroaching enemy queen and black's persistent counterplay. The queen's foray to b1 secures a valuable outpost, preparing to support a potential kingside breakthrough while keeping options open for a swift retreat, should the white king find a safer square. Sacrificing the rook for a checkmating net after the queen's inevitable promotion is a desperate, but theoretically sound, attempt to force the win. The final push for the rook now becomes the immediate priority, aiming to support the passed pawn's advance and ultimately force a decision in this long, tactical struggle. The king's perilous journey across the board finally brings the white rook to a vital intersection, aiming to sever the black queen's offensive reach and consolidate the advantage gained from earlier exchanges. Desperation forces a final check, a last gasp at survival before the inevitable queen's sacrifice. The monarch is now safely repositioned to a more active central square, ready to support the pawn push. A stunning discovered check forcing the king into a potentially perilous square, aiming to disrupt white's defense and perhaps even trap the monarch. Pushing the king forward now is a calculated risk, aiming to support the pawn majority on the queen side and potentially create passed threats, but it leaves him exposed if black's queen can penetrate the central ranks. The queen sacrifices herself, opening a path for the king to escape the mating net, but it's a desperate measure as the opposing king now possesses a decisive mating attack. Recognizing the immediate check and the threat to the king's safety, the king retreats to the relative sanctuary of g5, a necessary defensive maneuver to avoid being cornered and exposed to further attacks, while also keeping an eye on the passed pawn's potential. Chasing the enemy king across the board often creates opportunities for discovered attacks, and here black's queen delivers a check that uncovers the knight's threat to the f2 pawn, potentially leading to a swift conclusion if white isn't careful. The monarch, finally finding a safe haven, now has breathing room as the pawn structure solidifies, a crucial moment for consolidating a precarious advantage and preparing for the final push. The queen's detour to d4 is a calculated risk, probing for any weaknesses around white's monarch now that the pawns are so advanced. Instead of direct confrontation, this maneuver subtly prepares for potential discovered attacks or can pivot to support a pawn push, creating overextended lines for white to defend. It's a quiet move, but one that asks white difficult questions about their king's safety and the coordination of their remaining pieces. The queen becomes a powerful force, controlling key squares and potentially forcing white into passive, defensive postures. It allows black to regroup and assess white's next move, looking for opportunities to exploit any positional concessions. This maneuver also offers a way to trade down material if it proves advantageous, simplifying the position towards a favorable endgame. The queen now stands ready to support any breakthrough black might orchestrate. Opening up lines for the king to escape the perpetual checks is paramount, and this check achieves precisely that while also forcing the black queen to a less active square, giving white a breath of fresh air after a grueling defensive sequence. A desperate attempt to flee the inevitable mating net, but the king's escape route is blocked by an unassailable wall of pieces. Seeking to stabilize the board after the queen trade, the white rook advances to control the central file, aiming to improve its position and potentially assist in defending the king. Challenging the exposed white monarch with a final queen check aims to disrupt white's planned rook maneuver and potentially force a concession or create immediate tactical opportunities. Relocating the monarch to safety while maintaining pressure on the queenside pawns is the immediate concern, as the black queen's influence extends across the board. The black queen's foray to e3 presents a fresh challenge, forcing the white king into a tight spot and creating immediate threats. The king, finally stepping out of danger's way, seeks refuge on a safer square, a critical maneuver in this endgame of material scarcity where every tempo counts towards consolidation and eventual victory. The queen's repositioning, though seemingly active, releases the tension on the d-file and allows white to simplify into a more manageable endgame where their king might find better shelter. King's perilous flight continues, hoping to outmaneuver the persistent rook and reach safety, but the advanced pawn's presence creates a critical bottleneck that might just seal his fate. The pawn advances to g2, a desperate attempt to create a mating threat on the first rank while simultaneously defending against the imminent capture of the rook. This creates a complex tactical situation, forcing white to find a precise response to avoid immediate disaster. Pushing the king forward into the pawn storm might seem inviting, but its safety is paramount. The current pawn structure on the king side is a bit chaotic, and while the king is actively involved, it's also exposed to potential checks from black's queen or rook. A more prudent approach might involve consolidating the position, perhaps by preparing to advance a passed pawn or by finding a safe square for the king that still maintains some defensive capabilities. Consider how black's remaining pieces could coordinate an attack if the king continues its adventurous march. Queen promotion is now a decisive threat, forcing immediate attention. Finally, the king makes its decisive march, stepping into a space that was once contested, ready to support the pawns and escort them to glory. The queen's retreat to g5, while seemingly innocuous, aims to create a potential back-rank battery with the king on g2, eyeing that vulnerable square. It's a subtle shift, testing white's ability to defend against this latent threat while potentially preparing for a pawn push or repositioning for a more active role. The king, now exposed, becomes a target for white's remaining pieces as the queen trades on the promotion square, initiating a race against the pawn and potentially a desperate defense. Discovered attack on the queen. This forces a reshuffling of black's defensive formation and opens up the possibility for white to gain material or create immediate threats, aiming to exploit the disarray. Challenging the black queen's control of the dark squares and probing for weaknesses in the already compromised pawn structure opens up dynamic possibilities. Cutting off the white king's escape route is paramount, and this check forces a reaction, preventing any immediate king escape or piece regrouping. The king's escape route is now ruthlessly shut down as white's monarch asserts dominance, a stark contrast to the earlier defensive posture. Asserting dominance on the 7th rank with this check forces a critical decision for white's monarch, a pivotal moment where consolidating defensive lines or sacrificing material for initiative becomes paramount. The monarch is being steered to a safer sector of the board, seeking refuge from the imminent pawn push that threatens to liberate black's remaining pieces. The black queen finds an unstoppable path to deliver the final blow, a testament to its well-supported advance and the king's exposed position after the relentless pressure.